2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Let me bring Carey Kling into the conversation. She's with BQ Energy, who's a Terawatt sponsor. Carey, thank you so much. She's a business development director for BQ Energy, and they are another firm that's really blazed the trail. They've done as much of this work as anybody else in geographies across the United States and across the taxonomy, as I've described it, this world, all these species of properties and subspecies. They know all the exotic animals and like the back of their hand. Carey, come on in. You've assembled a great panel for us to start to drill into this issue more seriously. Oh, you're still muted though. Yep. There you go.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Great. Well, those were some nice projects in Vermont. That was fun to see those. So somebody has my slides there. Okay, great. So our panel is going to walk through the steps it takes to develop a solar project on a brownfield site, a utility scale project on a brownfield site. Next slide. So I'm Carey Kling. I work for BQ Energy, and BQ Energy is a renewable energy developer that builds exclusively on brownfields and landfills. We've been doing this since 2002. And here I provided a couple of examples of projects that we've built on brownfield sites. We have in upstate New York, we have a wind project on an abandoned steel mill site. You can see some of the scrap metal in the foreground of that wind turbine. In Annapolis, Maryland, we hold the title for the largest solar project on a landfill in the US. That's an 18 megawatt DC solar project that we completed in 2018. And I've included 2 development sites. So in Pennsylvania, we have a joint venture with Talon Energy. We're building projects on coal ash basins. We're still working through our permitting and selling the power, but we hope to go into construction next year on those sites. And I've included an early stage strip mine that we are developing in Montana. So these are 4 very different types of brownfield sites, and they're all great sites for renewable energy projects. Next slide. So the first thing to think about in terms of developing a site is really who's going to buy the power. Very few renewable energy projects are built on a merchant basis. Almost all of them have long-term power purchase contracts, and those are required to get a project built for the most part. So a long-term power purchase agreement is either 10, 20, or 30 years. And the typical buyer is a utility. This could be a large investor-owned utility like Dominion or AEP, or it could be a municipality or a co-op. And a lot of the renewable energy development by those types of utilities is driven by policy. On the map, the dark green states are all states which have a requirement for the utilities to purchase a certain amount of renewable energy or to have a certain amount of renewable energy in their generation portfolio. And of those states, probably half of them have a target of at least 50% or more of renewable energy in their portfolio. And Virginia became really stepped to the forefront became a leading state on that front last year, where they moved from having a goal of 15% to 100% for the large utilities in sort of the 2040, 2045 timeframe. So a major step change there for Virginia. So this map continues to evolve, and hopefully it'll all be green soon. Another buyer are corporate buyers, and you can see in this bar graph the kind of explosion of investment by corporate buyers over the last 10 years. And what you're seeing in the, by 2020 is billions of dollars of investment by corporations in renewable energy. And these corporations are either buying projects, they're buying the power from the projects, or they're buying the renewable energy credits from the projects. Basically, they are funding these projects being built. And they're quite a different type of buyer. So a developer could sell their power to these corporations but it's a little bit different. They have typically have shorter power purchase agreement contracts. They're more in the 10 to 15 years because that's about as far out as they can commit, in terms of their business planning. And it's also a little bit different selling to a corporate buyer where it really depends on the state and the utility where they're located, how you structure those deals. But they're definitely someone that could be considered a buyer of a project. So in terms of whether it's a utility or a corporation, you really need to understand what it is that they want, what size project they want, where do they want it. Like a utility may want it in a very specific region of their territory. When do they want it? Do they want it next year? Do they want it in the next 5 years? You really need to understand who, it's your customer. So what do they want? When do they want it? And at what price? And I think the last panel, there was a lot of discussion about, selling the cheapest power. And we really do compete to sell the cheapest power to these utilities. So it's a competitive process and you have to manage your cost in the development cycle, as we'll talk about on the next slide. So these are really basic development steps. So you have to, when thinking about selecting your site, we think brownfield sites are the best sites. There's a lot of reasons for that. The land is already compromised. It may, depending on the nature of the site, it may be really limited in terms of what its alternative uses could be. I've been doing development for about 15 years, and I find these brownfield sites actually cheaper to develop than a greenfield site. And that's because the historic environmental conditions of the sites have caused a lot of environmental studies to be done. And you can do that research up front. You don't have to fund that yourself. There's already this huge wealth of information, and you can really have confidence that you're not going to be moving into a sensitive habitat, that you're going to be working on a site that you can actually build on. So in terms of pre-existing conditions, so you can manage preventing yourself from taking on any liability of the pre-existing conditions by a number of mechanisms. One of them is really putting some very simple language in your lease agreement with the landowner. The regulators are also, through their permitting process, I think that they also really, they don't want to disturb the subsurface. So, they're trying to manage those environmental conditions as well. And we'll work with you on designing a project that's effective in doing that. And then again, just your simple design and construction practices can prevent any disturbance of the subsurface. So there's ways to manage, disturbing the subsurface and preventing any liability concerns. So once you've selected your site, then you need an agreement with the landowner. Once you go into construction, when you get to construction, you really need a 20 to 30 year lease agreement with the landowner. And really it's 20 to 30 years because that's the life of the assets, the life of the panels and the infrastructure. And it's also the life of the power purchase agreements, particularly for the big utilities. They want these longer term power contracts. So you have to have the land lease in place to provide for that. But you don't want to sign a 30-year lease at the outset. You need a couple of years to make sure that your site is viable and that you will have a viable project. So you need a 3-year option in the front to allow yourself to de-risk the site, to do all your studies and understand what your cost structure is and know that there aren't any fatal flaws in your project. So a typical agreement has a 3-year option up front and then a 20 to 30-year lease. Another important factor in siting your project is understanding where you're going to interconnect to the grid. And Josh will talk about that in a couple of minutes. But it's very important. It can be very costly to interconnect to the grid. And we are trying to build the most cost-effective project possible. So you really want to be strategic in where you're locating your project so that you can have an affordable interconnection. So we'll leave it to Josh to get into that. And you want to start that process early. There's a number of studies that have to be done and it can take a couple of years. So you want to start the interconnection process early. You also want to start your permitting early. And we have found that the regulatory agencies in a lot of states are very supportive of developing renewable energy on these brownfield sites. And it's just really a matter of engaging with them early and they will work with you through the process to get it done in a timely manner. You don't want to wait on starting your permitting. And we'll have Rick talk a little bit more about permitting in some projects at the end of the panel. And then selling the power. So as I said, you really, to build a project, you have to have a power contract to get to construction. And so it's really, I typically think of, you need at least a year to have some studies on the site done and understand what your interconnections costs are. You can have that first interconnection study done. And you really understand what the cost structure of your project is, and that will then allow you to determine what price you can sell your power for. And then you can go out there and start marketing the power, either through an RFP that a utility like Dominion issues, or just through bilateral contracts. So next slide. So then if you've completed all your permits and your studies and you've sold your power, then you can enter into construction. The construction is maybe six months to a year. And once the project is built, it's really kind of a minimal maintenance and investment is required. It's a very kind of quiet neighbor. In terms of investment dollars for the development cycle that I talked about during the option period, it costs anywhere from $500,000 to a few $1 million to do all those studies and get to the point of construction. And all those dollars are at risk until you have a power contract and you're ready to go into construction. So, so you really want to be sure that you sell that power so that you can recoup your development dollars. And in terms of capital investment, these are very capital intensive projects. It's anywhere from $1 million to $1.5 million a megawatt. So a 100 megawatt project would be more than $100 million of capital investment. So that's my quick overview. And now I'm going to turn it over to Robin, who works for Dominion, and she's going to tell us about what programs they have for brownfields.
Thanks, Carey. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. My name is Robin Lucey, and I'm a business development manager at Dominion Energy. Our team works on the self-development of solar projects, which includes managing the site selection, evaluating the point of interconnection for PJM filings, permitting activities, as well as the various work with the various subject matter experts on the due diligence tasks throughout the whole development process. Some of the items that we want to discuss with you this afternoon include the Virginia Clean Economy Act and its requirements for solar development on previously developed project sites, some overall benefits to localities, and what a utility scale solar project development timeline generally looks like for Dominion Energy Virginia. On this slide, you will see a summary of the Virginia Clean Economy Act, or VCEA. The Commonwealth of Virginia has been accelerating its transition to clean energy through passage of the Virginia Clean Economy Act that became law as of July 1st of last year and commits the state to achieving zero carbon emissions by 2050. It establishes requirements for Dominion Energy Virginia to incorporate a timeline into its integrated resource plan in order to meet the VCA requirements. It also incorporates a framework for a 100% zero carbon power generation mix by 2045 with critical customer protections around reliable electric service. For Dominion Energy Virginia, this includes solar as well as onshore wind. The VCA mandates 16,100 megawatts by 2035, with 200 megawatts to be on previously developed project sites, which are also known as brownfield sites. Some potential sites in which previously developed sites is attributable to or applicable to include sites such as landfills, formerly mined sites, commercial or industrial sites, or retail, or even parking lots. One project that Dominion is currently developing is the Dulles Solar Project located in Loudoun County on Dulles International Airport property. The project will be co-located with the Dulles Storage Project, creating Dominion's first solar plus storage hybrid facility. We are very interested in working with landowners for additional projects in order to meet these VCA requirements. And in addition to solar and onshore wind, the VCA mandates 5,200 megawatts of utility-owned or purchased in public interest of offshore wind and 2,700 megawatts of energy storage by 2035. Per the VCA, 65% can be company-owned and 35% can be through power purchase agreements in which third parties will also have the opportunity to sell us power to help with this effort. Next slide, please. Dominion Energy Virginia filed its first clean energy filing for projects for approval from the Virginia State Corporation Commission on November 2nd of last year. This filing is the largest slate of new solar facilities for Virginia customers in the company's history. These projects would bring 498 megawatts of solar energy to Virginia customers, which is enough to power around 125,000 homes at peak output. 82 megawatts are for Dominion Energy Virginia owned projects in which a certificate of public convenience and necessity or CPCN approval is required prior to construction beginning for these projects. These projects are Grassfield Solar in Chesapeake, Nord Solar in James City County, and Sycamore Solar in Pittsylvania County. 416 megawatts of energy would be generated at peak output through solar power purchase agreements of solar generating facilities owned by third parties. If approved, these resources will help us meet the VCA's mandatory renewable portfolio standard, which generally requires that 100% of its electricity sales in Virginia be sourced from clean energy resources by 2045. Next slide, please. The VCA requires solar development on previously developed project sites and establishes a minimum of 200 megawatts. So as you know, as I said before, this includes potential sites such as formerly mined property, landfills, and parking lots. And this year we expect to include these sites, these types of land that's on previously developed project sites or brownfield sites as part of our annual RFP, which is anticipated to be issued in late April. Next slide, please. There are several benefits to localities when considering solar projects. In addition to an increase to the local tax revenue, other benefits include the creation of clean energy jobs, projects using Virginia and locally based suppliers, and the projects that would support a clean and sustainable energy future in Virginia. Some typical site characteristics of a solar project are that they're emission-free, they're environmentally friendly, the maintenance is low, and they are quiet. Next slide, please. In addition, we have also included what a general timeline looks like for utility scale solar project development. The timeline generally will start with the site and survey work for the project layout and take about a year to complete. This work is started along with the county permitting process, which can take as long as 18 months depending on the number of public hearings and potential deferrals that may occur as part of that process. Following the permitting activities, we would then go through our engineering, procurement, and construction, or EPC vendor selection process. Once the EPC vendor is selected, they will submit the land disturbance permit. The SEC regulates the construction of public utility facilities, so the company would need to file for approval with them to get a certificate of public convenience and necessity. This is about a 6-month approval process. Once that's approved, the facility would begin construction, which would last about 18 months before reaching commercial operations. Next slide. And I just want to thank you very much for your time today, and we look forward to partnering with the communities in the Commonwealth of Virginia to power a greener future with renewable energy. So thank you.
Thanks, Robin. Okay, maybe well, I have one question for Robin.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So I was wondering, it's great that you guys have a carve out for brownfield projects, and I was wondering how you were going to consider other brownfield projects in the broader solicitation. Is there is it sort of a soft preference, or is there any sort of incentives for brownfields outside the kind of minimum 200 megawatts?
So, we're definitely looking to partner with landowners that, have, sites that are, on previously developed project sites, and, through the RFP process, there's going to be a specific checklist that will show what requirements are out there for these previously developed sites. So we are definitely, endeavoring to meet the requirements, and and if projects, exceed that, that's a great, outcome for the Commonwealth.
Okay, great. Okay, well, we might come back to Robin with some more questions, but let's turn to Josh, and Josh will talk about transmission.
Great, thank you so much. My name is Josh Berkow. I'm a senior electrical engineer at Mott MacDonald, working in the renewables business. But our power group, like a lot of power groups, it's transmission and distribution, renewables, traditional generation, and basically anything related to power. You can jump to the next slide, please. So everybody's probably seen a diagram that looks like this before. It's this isn't one that I necessarily made. I just grabbed it from somewhere on the internet. The transmission system is generally broken up into 3 sections, and most people have heard transmission and distribution, and there's this intermediate thing called subtransmission that is kind of like one and kind of like the other, but not exactly like either of them. So what kind of project you do and how big a project you do is largely going to be driven on by where you're connecting. If you're on the transmission system, it's regulated by the federal government. In the case of Virginia, the authority having control over the interconnection is the Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland interconnection, also called PJM, and its voltage classes of 69,000 volts up to 765,000 in the case of PJM, and that varies nationwide. There's the distribution grid, which is always operated by your local distribution company, whether that's Dominion or AEP or a local co-op. Those are much lower voltage systems, 4,000 to 14,000 volts, sometimes up to 35,000 volts. It's really location dependent. And those are much smaller projects, but they're also regulated by the state government, so the process is a little different. And then you have the in-between stuff, which is subtransmission, which is an intermediate voltage, 35,000 to 69,000 volts. You can do larger projects, but you have to be careful because you might be regulated by federal, you might be regulated by state, you might be regulated by both. And these aren't clear-cut lines. I can find you places in the country where there is state-regulated transmission, and I can find you places in the country where there is federally regulated distribution. And so you always have to check first before filing to see which jurisdiction you're actually under. Generally, transmissions can be larger projects, 20 megawatts or more, in order to justify the cost of a transmission connection. Though not always. A lot of brownfield sites have their own substation already, in which case you may be able to do a very small project that is still federally regulated and on the transmission system. Similarly, I've seen 50 megawatt projects on the distribution system. It just so happened it was a very beefy distribution system at that location, which is to say there's nothing very clear cut about this, and every one of these projects is going to be a little bit unique in that regard. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, you basically have 2 areas of jurisdiction: PJM, which is governed by the federal government, and the State Corporation Commission, which directly regulates the distribution companies. If you're in federal jurisdiction, there's basically 2 processes you go under: small generator and large generator, which just very straightforward. If you're 20 megawatts or under, you're a small generator. If you're over 20 megawatts, you're a large generator. The process is longer and more expensive for a large generator than a small generator, which you would kind of expect. And that's basically all I'm going to talk about PJM for now. If you are looking to build large transmission connected projects, we generally just say find a consultant to help you with it, because they are complex and use up a lot of time and resources, and we can spend all day just talking about that. But a lot of brownfield sites honestly aren't big enough to support such a large federally jurisdictional project, and so a lot of these are going to be under the state rules. In Virginia, and their rules are not the same as every other state, so you can't necessarily take these across state lines. Every state's got its own rules. You basically have 3 levels: level 1, 2, and 3. So small projects under 500 kilowatts, medium-sized projects under 2 megawatts, and large projects over 2 megawatts. And as we'll see on the next slide, the distinction between those is also not necessarily that clean cut. So next slide, please. So this will probably load slowly. It's unfortunately our standard PowerPoint presentations load all sorts of nice graphics into them as opposed to just popping them up right away. But generally, the process for going through interconnection is roughly the same everywhere, in that, you file your application, you have a meeting, you do your studies, and then you get into construction. In the case of Virginia, and well, in this case, I'm only presenting the level 3 process because the level 1 and 2 are much more straightforward and simple and have fewer pitfalls that could bump into you. Generally, we recommend wherever you are, if it's a level 1 or 2, 3 interconnect, if it's a PJM interconnection, reach out informally to the whoever the regulator is to understand the process and your point of interconnection. As we'll discuss later, that is the best way to get information about where your POI is and what you think could tie in there before you spend a bunch of money actually trying to get a study through. So in Virginia, there's a pre-application process. There's a standard form you fill out. You can do both informal and formal requests. Informal ones are free, but there's a limit to the number that you can do. Formal ones have a fee associated with them. Once you've done that, you'll decide on how big a project you want to try to do, and you'll put in your application. The rules in Virginia don't specifically say that you need to have a licensed professional engineer prepare this for you, but I would certainly suggest that you have somebody in your back pocket if you're not having them do it, because they'll help you out of any situations you get into. The utility will run a screening study basically to see which process you should actually be in. And so if your project's small enough, yeah, you go through level 1. If it's interim, you go through level 2. If it's larger, you go through level 3. But they also need to look and see if your project has any dependencies on other projects. So if there's 2 projects connecting to the same line, they might be dependent on each other, and that could force you into the level 3 process if you're dependent on somebody else. Similarly, if the line that you're connecting to is already overloaded with distributed generation, that could again force you into the level 3 process. So as a 500 kW project, if you're the last one in and you're going to cause an overload on the line and they find that out in screening, you're going to go through level 3 process, as opposed to getting to go through the relatively inexpensive and fast level 1. If you're doing a larger project, you're just going to end up in this anyway. Generally, after screening, they're going to schedule a scoping meeting with you, which is generally not in person. It's usually on the phone. That is your opportunity to ask as many questions as you can that you didn't get answered in pre-application, both about the process, including the things that aren't explicitly stated in the process, as well as the whole configuration of wherever you're tying in, because most of that info isn't public. And so this is your time to ask the questions, find out what the system is configured as, and then hopefully guide the utility in a direction that is beneficial to you. As part of the scoping meeting, they're going to decide what studies you need to do. Generally, there's 3. There's feasibility, system impact, and facility study. And depending on the results of the screening study and scoping meeting, you may have to do all 3 of those. And that's why you see it says study agreement, utility perform a study, have a review meeting, repeat as needed. So you may be able to skip all of those and go right to facility study, or skip all of them and go right to an interconnect agreement, or you might be stuck going through 3 studies, and generally you're going to decide that at the scoping meeting. And jump forward 1, there's another row that's here. Once you're done with the studies, you're going to hold a construction planning meeting, basically to come up with, all right, how are we actually going to execute this thing? Get your interconnection agreement together, and then you're going to build your facility. The utility is going to build their facility. You're going to energize and test. All right, let's move on to the next one. So there's supposed to be one set of rules across the state. There's a statewide process. Everyone's supposed to follow it. But how it's actually implemented is going to vary from location to location. As you can see, APCO and Dominion really have a significant amount of the state, but also there's 13 electric cooperatives that cover the state, as well as the municipal utilities. And the municipal utilities don't even have to follow the state rules. They just make up their own. But the investor-owned utilities and the co-ops have to follow the state rules, but they're going to implement them slightly differently every time because they have their own distribution planning standards and their own construction standards that you're going to have to comply with. Additionally, there's always flex in the rules. So in the construction scoping, they're going to talk about what submittals you need to provide to the utility and when, and that's going to vary depending on the utility. Some of them are going to want more information than others. Some of them are going to want things PE stamped. Some of them aren't, and you're not going to know what those are until you have interaction with that specific utility. And so while the process is generally the same, it's the details that are always going to get you. And as you can see, you need to find out exactly whose lines you're tied into to see whose rules you're playing by. Next slide, please. So one of the things that you find out is that if for these distribution projects, there's not a lot of good information that's publicly available about the interconnection or about the distribution grid. If you're on the transmission system, it's public. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission makes it public. At the state level, you have to rely on the utility and have a capacity hosting map. Dominion in this case does. To my knowledge, they're the only one in Virginia that does, and that's what the image is on the right. So you can basically click around the state and look and see by color code how much available capacity is on their distribution lines. Beyond this, you have to file those pre-application requests to get any more information than what you'd see on this hosting map, and it just only covers Dominion. So even if you're in co-op territory, Dominion's not going to cover it. They're not going to cover APCO or KU or anybody else. The info is only updated quarterly, and it doesn't include projects that aren't committed for construction. So you see on here, right, there's an orange line that's, according to the legend, says it should have 8 megawatts of capacity on it. Well, somebody may have already filed an 8 megawatt request on that line, in which case it's all gone. But the time that you actually pulled this map up, they don't show up there. And so even with this map, you still have to go to the utility and ask for a pre-application info to see what is actually going on those lines, which is why people often refer to the interconnection process as spray and pray. Throw out a lot of it, especially for people who are doing true greenfield development. You throw out a lot of interconnection requests and kind of see what sticks. And in the case of brownfields, it's mostly you put your request in and just be prepared to downsize your project to what the grid can actually support within whatever your project budget is. Next slide, please. And one last note here, I noted you have to ask about what the queue date is, and that's because PJM maintains a public interconnection queue. So if you're doing transmission projects, or if your distribution project somehow got bumped into PJM, which does happen, then the queue information is publicly available. The stuff on the distribution grid isn't, and they aren't required in Virginia to publish it. So you have to go ask for it on a feeder by feeder basis. It's not like, New York or New England where that stuff's public. California, it's public. You can just go download it off the internet. But one of the things to think about here is how much solar is actually coming for Virginia. And this is part of also why your interconnection process tends to be spray and pray, because even if you had good queue data, the queue basically shows you that there is going to be more solar in Virginia than there is load in Virginia. And so is Virginia just going to become a net export of solar power to the entire PJM footprint? Or are a lot of those projects actually not going to happen? And the answer is some of the above. Could be both. But PJM does a load forecast all the time, and you can see the load is not changing. That's the pink line. The purple line, on the other hand, shows what the PJM queue has historically been with the proposed in-service dates of these projects. And the stuff after 2021 is heavily slanted towards offshore wind, but still many of those projects could become real. And so is Virginia to become a net exporter or not? And it's a kind of, don't know. It is really a guess. And I see somebody popped a question just reminding the 3 levels of distribution. There is distribution, which is 4,000 to 14,000 volts. There's sub-transmission, which is roughly 35,000 to 69,000 volts. And there's transmission, which is 69,000 up to sky's the limit. Next slide, please. And yep, that's pretty much all I have. Thank you.
So, Josh, I have a couple of questions. Can you just give people an idea of how long the study process takes and about how much that costs? And maybe just compare the sub-transmission and transmission level, just to give people an idea.
Sure. So if you had to go through the PJM process, that could be a 2 to 3 year process just to get your interconnection agreement, and could be a significant investment of dollars. You could be looking at over $100,000 just for that. It is significantly less if you're in the state process. The state process is roughly, especially if you have to go through level 3, it's roughly 10 grand plus $1 a kilowatt.
Okay. Great.
Sorry, not $1 a kilowatt, $1,000 a kilowatt, my bad.
So
a megawatt project is 10 grand plus 20 grand. That's generally the fees that you would expect to pay on a distribution level project.
So I'm going to ask you my favorite question to ask you, which is, there are 2 69 kV lines adjacent to my site. How do I decide which one I file for interconnection to?
Excellent question. Well, you could certainly file for both, depending on if you have to go through the PJM process. They let you do a primary and secondary POI. POI meaning point of interconnection. And so you can just file for both, and then at your scoping meeting, you'll sort it out. You could certainly, if you're at the state level, you can certainly file your pre-application request, which either you do the informal one, but obviously there's a limit to those, or you pay for a formal one, and then they will identify the lines to you, the rated capacity, and what queued projects are on there.
Great.
Or alternatively, especially if it's transmission connected, you hire a consultant like me, and I can look into the PJM models for you and see at least what the line ratings are and what the queued projects on there are. And then it's just take a guess.
Can you talk about mistakes you see people making in filing for interconnections? That's something that you've seen people do, or they come to you after they've made a mistake, or?
Yep, that does happen. I think the biggest mistake we see is mostly at the transmission level. Is it's going to take a long time to get through. And if it's going to take 3 years to get through, the equipment that you're buying now may not even be commercially available in 3 years. And so, especially at the transmission level, just file whatever. It doesn't matter that much. It needs to be internally consistent and make sense. But if you've decided, oh, I can get a good deal on a different inverter today, let me go update PJM, don't do that. Don't do that. Wait till you're ready to buy your equipment before you update at the transmission level, because it's just going to slow you down and it's going to cost you money, and it doesn't actually benefit you. On the distribution level, on the other hand, you should have a good idea of what you actually want to use from an inverter perspective up front, because the process is going to be significantly quicker, it's going to be significantly cheaper, and the equipment is still going to be available. And the utility can be more of a pain about changing your equipment.
Okay.
If you do need to change, make sure you have a planning engineer on board on your side to help argue with the utility and prove to them that inverters are inverters are inverters are inverters. They're all basically the same from a performance perspective on the AC side. They have different cost parameters. They're different from an O&M perspective. They're different from an installation perspective. But when you talk about the aggregate performance of a solar inverter on the electrical grid, they are all effectively the same. They're made from the same components that are all made by about 5 or 6 different vendors. And then all of the inverter vendors just package them up.
Okay. I have one more question. In looking at all the congestion that you highlighted in the interconnection queue, how does that shake out for people? So not all these projects are going to get it built. How does that affect people that have gone through the study process? There's estimates for what it's going to cost to build a project, but then the projects ahead of them don't get built. How does that sort of affect people in the queue?
It really varies. In many cases, you're going to get huge upgrade costs thrown at you, and they won't actually ever materialize. That's most of the
right. They'll estimate more than you actually have to pay.
Yep. Yeah. So on the PJM side, you'll get a feasibility study and an impact study that'll tell you have millions and millions of dollars of upgrades, and those will go away when you get to facility study, because prior queue projects will have dropped out of the queue. On the distribution side, on the other hand, it does happen, but the cost estimates they give you aren't particularly good early on, and they don't often take into account prior queue projects. So in the distribution system, you are more likely to get surprised with a cost increase at the end than a cost decrease at the end, mostly because somebody ahead of you actually became real and then they lumped you in, whereas PJM assumes everybody's real and then throws them out at the end.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Josh. We may have some more questions for you at the end, but maybe we'll turn it over to Rick to talk about permitting and construction and some projects he's worked on.
Okay. So can you folks see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Carey. Thanks, everyone, for having me. I'm Rick Buffalini. I work with Civil and Environmental Consultants in Pittsburgh. Also like to thank my co-presenter, Abigail Wallace, who helped to pull this together. So I'm going to primarily talk about permitting and design considerations, and then go over a few case studies for you. Real quick, CEC is 1,000 employees and 26 offices. We work with a lot of markets that end up doing brownfield projects, including manufacturing, mining, oil and gas, power and real estate, and solid waste. So we've done quite a few projects with different developers in different locations. There are specific permitting and design considerations to be addressed on solar development projects on brownfields and landfills. Many of these sites already have environmental permits from when the facility operated. These may include solid or residual waste permits or NPDES permits, as well as dam safety permits for CCR impoundments. Landfills or impoundments may also be in post-closure monitoring care. Typically, the landfill operating permit will need to be modified to allow construction on a closed landfill. But oftentimes, the NPDES permit, if there is one, will not need to be modified for the proposed project. Because these projects are on land that was previously disturbed, there's typically less potential for impacting wetlands and addressing threatened and endangered species or historic locations, at least for the portion of the project on the disturbed area. If portions of the project are not on previously disturbed areas, there's typically flexibility in the design stage to avoid these sensitive areas so that new permits are not required. Just like any solar development project that's not on a brownfield site, you may also need approval from the local planning and zoning departments and on the aspects of the project you also need approval from local and zoning departments, and also probably a building permit for structures. Because solar projects are relatively new, you may need to provide additional information to the permit reviewers, both on the environmental and on the zoning side, on the aspects of the project that they may not be familiar with. So brownfields and landfills do present design considerations that can be opportunities, but there's also some challenges. The opportunities can include that these sites are often on large, or can be at least on large open areas, on property that is not currently being productively used. The sites may have existing infrastructure in place, including roads, fencing, surface water controls, and importantly, as Carey and Josh were just talking about, nearby electric grid connections. With respect to the regulatory review and public acceptance, we've seen a lot of support for solar projects on brownfield sites. Because some permits are already in place and the general support, the time for environmental permitting can be quicker than for a greenfield site. And then finally, the projects can benefit the local community or the property owner by providing local power for smaller projects, and there's potential grants for developing brownfield sites. There can certainly be challenges as well associated with developing brownfields and landfills, but fortunately the project layout can be modified to address these issues. Most closed landfills have a cap system that must be maintained, and some sites have slopes that need to be addressed, they're too steep, and there may be existing facility infrastructure that needs to be avoided. Depending on the type and age of landfill, settlement may be an issue, and brownfield sites may have contaminated soil at the surface that must be addressed. Some of the primary design considerations are addressing the existing cap system of a landfill and the existing grades. Depending on the type of landfill or CCR impoundment when it was closed, the site could have a soil or a geomembrane cap system. The cap integrity is a key component of a closed landfill, so maintaining the cap must be addressed. The other thing is that solar project developers often prefer the slopes to be less than 15%, so steeper areas may need to be avoided or regraded if feasible. The solar panel racking system must have a foundation to resist wind uplift forces. The solar panels are similar in shape to a plane wing and are subject to uplift, so the foundation must resist those uplift forces. There are two options for a foundation. One is a driven post and the other is a ballast block. Driven posts are simply steel posts driven through the cap system into the underlying waste material or soil. The cap penetration may need to be repaired with a boot to prevent infiltration. For some sites, we need to confirm that the post will not penetrate the liner system beneath the waste if there's a liner there. The post depth is designed based on geotechnical information of the material, but the design is then confirmed by site-specific pull-out tests. Ballast blocks, on the other hand, are large concrete blocks that provide the resistance to uplift. They do not require the cap system to be penetrated, However, they are typically more expensive than driven posts, and with so many blocks required, it can be a significant cost impact. Some of the other design considerations to avoid on a landfill or an impoundment may include things like a gas collection and control system, leachate management system, surface water controls, and vegetation. But as I said earlier, most of those features can be designed around during the project layout. So I'm going to present two case studies on developing solar projects on former landfill sites. Both are in areas that you may not typically think of as suitable for solar power, and one's located in Ohio and the other in Pennsylvania. The project in Brooklyn, Ohio is 5 miles southwest of Cleveland, Ohio. This map shows the location of the city of Brooklyn in relation to Cleveland. The city issued the RFP for the project in 2016. The site's located on a solid waste landfill that's owned by the city of Brooklyn. The disposal area is about 40 acres in area. The landfill accepted waste until 2010, and closure was completed in 2015. The landfill was capped with 3 feet of compacted soil. You can see from this aerial photograph that the area is densely populated with neighborhoods and commercial development located very close to the disposal area. So the project was designed and constructed in 2 phases, with the first phase encompassing 20 acres and providing 4 megawatt capacity. The entire project has 12 megawatt capacity. This picture here. Some of this design drawing shows some of the features that we needed to avoid. These are gas vents that needed to be avoided at this location here, and there are leachate wet wells and side soap risers over on this part of the site that we needed to design around. But this project provided it used land that would not have been used otherwise, and it supplies about 5% of the electricity consumption of the 16 county buildings. One of the specific design elements of this project was that the developer decided to use a ballast foundation. So the ballast did not require cap penetration. You can see them here. It's basically these concrete blocks with the solar racking system attached to those. Because the project was developed on a permitted landfill, we did need to submit a permit modification to the Ohio EPA describing the project and how we would maintain the integrity of the landfill with the solar project. Not that this would be typical, but it's kind of noteworthy that we submitted the application in April of 2017, and the EPA approved the request 1 month later. So it goes to speak to the support that you can have from your regulatory agencies as well as the local community for projects like this. But I would caution folks not to plan on a 1 month review and approval time, typically. The project was constructed, phase 1 was constructed in 2018, and here's a nice photograph of the ribbon cutting ceremony. The second case study is at the Pittsburgh International Airport. There was a municipal solid waste landfill on the property that was owned by the airport authority. This landfill was built whenever some waste was relocated from another portion of the property when a runway was constructed there. You can see the runways here. The landfill is this red area outlined below. The landfill is 25 acres. It has a clay liner in the bottom with a leachate collection system, and it was capped with 2 feet of soil cover. This drawing shows the landfill disposal area, surface water control structures around the perimeter, a sedimentation pond, and leachate treatment plant at the toe slope. All of this infrastructure needed to be considered in the panel layout. This project was also proposed to be constructed in phases with a total area of 17 acres and a capacity of 7.3 megawatt DC. Like the Brooklyn project, this was also built on land that was otherwise not going to be developed by the airport, because of the waste disposal that was there. The power is going to be used to power buildings at the Pittsburgh Airport. So unlike the prior project, this one used steel post foundations instead of ballast blocks. We did site-specific geotechnical testing to determine the required length of the foundation post. The posts at this site are about 9 feet long and were driven through the cap system into the underlying waste. Because the post penetrates the cap system, we did need to install a low permeability material around the post to reduce the chance for infiltration through the soil. Though not a particular issue at this site, we also needed to confirm that the post would not damage the underlying liner system. This detail shows the post with the bottom section below grade and the top section with the solar panel attached. This project also, because it was constructed on a closed landfill, did require Pennsylvania DEP approval. We submitted the application in January 2020 and received approval in January 2021. Construction is ongoing. You can see the driven post being inserted into the cap system. Here's the post driver, and construction is ongoing currently. So to summarize, with proper site selection and planning, solar development on these brownfield and landfills can have advantages over greenfield sites. They can be easier to permit than greenfield sites, and they can be quicker to obtain environmental permits. There's also less public and regulatory opposition, so they do provide both opportunities and challenges to develop. And that's the end of it.
Thanks, Rick. That's awesome. I'm just going to jump in briefly to announce our soft break ahead of the top of the hour in our next session. So if you would like to stand up, grab a cup of coffee, go ahead. But we are going to take some bonus time here for questions. And I think, Carey, you probably have some questions right now for Rick.
Yes, we do have a good question here is, Rick, have you seen any projects that have been built that then had to go under some sort of post-construction review?
Carey, because on the landfills, many of those sites are in a post-closure monitoring period. It's generally 30 years of post-closure monitoring after the facility is closed. So many of the projects we're working on, the landfills or the CCR impoundment, are in post-closure monitoring. So we do need to address the post-closure period as these projects are developed. So that review would continue to require things like maintaining vegetation, you know, all the types of things that would have to happen at a landfill or an impoundment, even without this project.
Have you seen a project that maybe, you know, if it was anticipated that, you know, it's some sort of brownfield site and there's already plans that the site, once it's closed, will become a solar project? Have you ever seen different standards for cleanup set because a solar project was going to be built on that site, or anything like that?
I have not.
Yeah.
That would be interesting. It would be nice to know, you know, if that type of thing was going to happen. It would be good to know early on, wouldn't it?
If I can ask another question, I hear the bells ringing. What type of trouble do you see developers getting into, and how should we avoid it?
Yeah, good questions, Carey. I think the schedule is often an issue. And I think, like you had addressed in your presentation, that, you know, being in touch with folks early, you know, the regulatory reviewers, the local planning and zoning folks, being in touch with them early is certainly a help in reducing the potential for delays in projects. And like we talked about, the projects are sometimes new, so folks that are reviewing them may not be familiar with what they're looking at. So to help educate them and, you know, address their questions and answer their questions up front can be helpful.
Dan, I can keep asking questions all day long. Are there any questions coming in that we should answer, or can I just keep firing away?
Yeah, you can keep firing away. I'll ask you a question. Nobody's asked you a question. So first, thank you. This has been a terrific panel. And thank you just as a carbon-based life form on this planet for the work that BQ has been doing these many years. I actually, when I was a young attorney at BP, we had peak oil and then the bottom fell out. And so I kind of broadened after that. I started looking at end use more widely, and it was actually Paul's work when I first found, wow, solar on landfills.
Yeah.
This is like 2011, 10. It really blew my mind, and so I don't know if I've ever told Paul that, but that's the truth, and kind of planted a seed that has led to us being here today. So sorry, that wasn't a question.
Great to hear, though.
Tip of the cap, and you and your experience, I'm kind of in this end of the beginning camp. Can you just look ahead, this moment that we're in right now, and the wealth of experience that you guys had, and look forward, particularly in Virginia?
Oh, well, there's going to be a lot of projects, and it's going to be a very busy season for all the regulators and the utilities trying to make all these projects happen, and it should be fun.
Yeah, and what about you, Robin? Thank you, and thank Dominion for plugging in. We're so thrilled that you guys are on board, and seeing everybody line up over there and get behind these new obligations is really exciting.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. And I just want to say thank you to everyone and the whole panel, and thank you for organizing this and emceeing this event. You've been great, and yeah, Dominion just looks forward to working with everyone here and landowners, and just the continued development of solar. So we're really excited for this opportunity. So thank you.
Thanks, Robin.
Yeah, we were waiting. These brownfields have been waiting a long time. Believe you me. Especially at scale. I mean, we've had a lot of brownfield success here and there, a lot of mixed use. The built environment's been changing, but to see solar prices come down the way that they have, and to see all these other things, the way that we can sneak things in on into these redevelopments, like Carey, a quarter acre or a half acre goes a long way when you're talking about flower patches or community paths or whatever, right? Let me ask you that, like, get creative. We've seen, dealing with slope, how you have to align panels, and, kind of the sky's the limit on this kind of stuff.
Well, engineers can solve a lot of problems. It's just a matter of money on.
Right. But if a community, I've seen very proactive communities put their wants and needs forward and then work together. There's ways, even adjacent landowners can get involved, and this collaborative spirit that I'm seeing emerge in this space is very, very encouraging. The public and the private sector working uniquely together, and as we mentioned many times throughout the day, even Democrats and Republicans. So yeah, I'm super constructive. Thanks again, anybody. Carey, do you have any final thoughts for us? We've got maybe 1 minute before the top of the hour.
No, this has been great, and it is going to be exciting in Virginia. There's they've really kind of setting some standards for the rest of the country. So we're off to the races now. Yep.
Public, private sector, the utility, the communities, landowners, and all the professionals in between, and they're all assembled here today. So thank you, and hopefully bringing in some fresh eyes, some fresh blood to the Renaissance, because as I think has already popped up, and we're going to get into this later in the program, I think one of our key bottlenecks is just going to be brains. We don't have enough people. So all you young people listening now or streaming this later, I hope you're getting some really good ideas about what you could be throwing your professional career and life's ambition at over the next 50 years or however long it's going to take to repair all this damage from the Industrial Revolution. So thanks, guys. Thanks again. Really terrific. Just great from top to bottom. And do these guys know what they're talking about? The guys and gals, you guys are really on your stuff. So I appreciate your professionalism, and let's try to introduce our next, well, let's see, I've got how many seconds left? None.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks again. Yeah.
Tranquility Base here.